All right. Welcome, everyone, to tonight's class, which is all about working with containers and planters. My name is Marianne Simon. I am an instructor with G3 Green Gardens Group. My colleague tonight is Pamela Bursler, a longtime landscape designer, contractor, and the founder of G3. So we are super, super excited to be with you. Let's get started. All right. So for those of you that have been with us before, you will recognize the puzzle. And the puzzle serves as a reminder that everything that we do in the landscape is connected. So even as we're talking about planters and containers, it's not just about the plants, it's not just about the type of container, but it really is how do all of the pieces work together? And that as you're looking at making your choices, what are the things you need to look at in context? So, we have folks from Bozeman here tonight. We have folks from California. We have folks from other parts of the country. And so your situation is going to be a little different than someone else's. So these are like guidelines, directions, ways to inspire you. And then there is definitely a little bit of experimenting that will happen on your end. So as we start, the 6 pieces of tonight's puzzle, we start out with why planters. Number 2 is a conversation about soil, which we have in all of our classes. Number 3, the importance of water and drainage. This is definitely something that can kill your plants if you are not aware of what you need to do in order for that to work properly. Number 4, for some of you, you might be interested in actually building your own planter. So we'll explore that. Number 5, oh my goodness, this one's like being a kid in a candy shop, looking at the different container options. And then number 6, the reason some of you may be here is, well, what kinds of plants actually work in a container? What are some of the different ways that I can organize them, design them so that they feel as aesthetically pleasing in the landscape as possible? So we're going to start outdoors with planters that are made of wood. And we do make a distinction between containers and planters. So for the most part, when we're talking about planters, we are talking about these larger constructed items, oftentimes out of wood, but not exclusively. So in some cases, you've got planters that are less than 12 inches, where you're potentially on your knees in order to work them. And then you've got planters, obviously, that are taller than 12 inches, that are perhaps a little easier on the back, more accessible. But both of them are going to have some of their own specific requirements and parameters. Now, we looked at wood, which is probably the least expensive when it comes to making a planter or having a planter, but you can absolutely get a little bit fancier. So these are lovely planters, and they are made with stone. So yes, if you can do that, that's definitely a lovely option. And then this is sort of an in-between. So it's going to be more expensive than wood, probably less expensive than that stone. And that is working with CMU block planters, with CMU block, which come in lots of different shapes and colors. And so here, this is up against a building, a really nice option. Also, it's got really good drainage. And then this one, you're potentially working with a designer in order to get something that really works well and is aesthetically pleasing. And that is working with poured in place concrete. So in that case, they're actually creating forms, pouring the concrete, and then integrating it into the rest of the landscape. And then, of course, when it comes to containers, we're usually talking about prefabricated containers, and they come in all different shapes and sizes. We'll definitely take a closer look at some of those. And then this is really interesting. So oftentimes when we think about planters, we think of them as containers for the plants. But depending on what you find, and we'll definitely look at some creative options, the possibility that the planters themselves become pieces of art or works of art. So now we're not just integrating a planter into the landscape, we're actually integrating art into the landscape. And there's so many different options here. And then this one's actually kind of fun. So the idea, sky's the limit here, that the planters can actually be incorporated into your furniture. So in this case, a planter, and then they were able to put a glass table on top of it. All right, so why planters? So in some cases, having a planter, and usually a planter more than a container, is because you actually have to. In that there are issues with the soil, with your garden, with your landscape that make growing a garden, especially an edible garden, challenging. So the first one is when we look at the soil in terms of its compaction. So in some cases you've got hard pan or caliche in there, and basically it means that there is this level of soil that is so hard, it is almost impossible to work. And it's deep enough that it's not like you're going to sit there and dig it out. Now, in some cases, you can do things with like drills and create little holes and so forth. But if it's throughout the garden, that might actually be a little unwieldy. So this might be a reason. Another reason, and I had this happen with one of my clients, is that there are pollutants in the soil. And that can happen from just about anything. Oftentimes it happens as a result of construction. You've had your house painted, they clean out the brushes and then they take that water, and instead of getting rid of it the way they're supposed to, they just dump it into the garden. And typically that shows up in the form of heavy metals. So you've got things like cadmium, nickel, copper, and things like arsenic. And then when you've got that in the soil in high enough amounts, then it will actually stunt your plants. And if you're growing edibles, definitely not something that you want to be ingesting. And then for those that are along the coast, although this can happen certainly in other parts of the country as well, is that there are high salt levels. So high salinity is an issue in most arid and semi-arid regions, because basically what will happen is you'll get like a buildup of salts, and we don't have enough rain to actually leach that salt out of the soil. So it just builds up and builds up to the point where it becomes toxic for our plants. And believe it or not, there are actually salts in our irrigation. So again, that buildup over time, if you don't have the rain to leach it out, you start having issues with the health of your plants. And then in some cases, weeds gone crazy. You've done your best, and no matter what you do, they just keep coming up. So in this case, your best solution might be, to weed whack it down to the ground, mow it down to the ground, and then use your planters. And we're going to talk with barriers in there or individual containers within which to grow your plants. Now, in some cases, if you've got any sort of hillside or slope and you want to create any sort of terracing, so instead of it being a slope, which can be really challenging to landscape on, the possibility that you create terraces, and then on those terraces, you bring in these planters. Now, when we start doing that, when we start cutting into hillsides, this is definitely when you want to bring in a professional to help you design and install that. And then, and I'm certainly feeling it now as I've gotten a little bit older, that never-ending leaning over to a garden can actually start to be a little bit challenging. So the idea that you can create planters or containers that are more accessible, that are a little bit easier to work with. And then the different tools, I mean, literally you can pull up a chair and snip off your salad greens, and it just makes gardening more enjoyable and more accessible. More reasons why you might want to be looking at planters or containers are because you've got limited space. So especially if you've got things like balconies, porches, even rooftops, and we're going to look at that in just a minute. And you want to create this abundance, and you feel kind of limited. There are ways that you can expand by working in different heights. This was the same space. So it's, first off, way more interesting than it was before. We now have multiple layers. And then in addition to the planters that they put, along the border, they've also added some containers to add, again, more interest. more opportunities to plant. And then in some cases, you've got really, really limited space, or you have no soil. And in that case, you are reliant on planters or on containers in order to bring in the greenery. And as you can see from this image, there are so many things. You can get so creative with what is possible. And we're actually going to be doing a class at the end of the year that focuses specifically on small spaces. And you can see all the different things that you can use to create a really welcoming and unique space. And then, of course, this is one of my favorites, the possibility that you take, especially the containers, and you actually mix them into the landscape. So benefits of that is, again, this idea that you're adding art into the landscape, color, that all of a sudden it's not just softscape, but we're now adding what you would call more hardscape, and that it raises the level of certain plants. So if you've got especially like a lot of ground cover or a lot of low growing shrubs, all of a sudden there's like this sort of raising and highlighting or framing a plant, and it becomes a focal point in the landscape as well. And then certainly when it comes to design and aesthetics, now, obviously at this point, you are potentially working with a landscape designer to help you imagine this. But for example, if all of this was already here or is already there, the possibility of then bringing in those beautiful terracotta pots there and adding, the potential of framing a doorway or framing an entry. And it's like putting art on the wall in some ways, or art in the house. This is a way of bringing it out into the landscape. Other possibilities, containment and seating. So it can be the idea that when we bring things into the garden is that they have multiple purposes. So your first thought would have been, well, I want to put a planter here because I want to put in some fruit trees, for example. But then thinking about it and the possibility that I make that planter just a little bit wider, maybe it's now 12 inches or 18 inches, and that planter now not only holds my plants, but also provides outdoor seating. More opportunities. I'll bet you hadn't thought of all of these. The idea that we can use them almost like architecture, that you can use them to create borders, boundaries, create, walls of sorts. And it doesn't have to be as though you're putting, containers all the way across, but it creates the illusion that there is a separation between this area and the other area. And then potentially, you're planting small fruit trees in there, you're planting herbs in there. So what you fill them is a whole other conversation. So pretty much, as I have alluded to, planters can go anywhere. Containers can go anywhere. So we've seen examples of them tucked in the landscape, patios, balconies, decks. Even if there is no existing soil, you can bring greenery into your space. And then on a roof. So the one thing to be aware of with planters and containers on the roof is how much they can weigh. So before you start bringing a lot of stuff onto the rooftop, it's definitely worth finding out how much weight actually can be supported by a roof. And it's not just the plant, it's the container, the soil, the wetness, the water when you put it in the soil, and obviously as it grows. So the next piece of the puzzle is the soil. Now, depending on whether you're using planters or containers, one of the questions you may be asking is, well, can I use native soil? Can I just dig the soil out of my garden and put it into my planter and or container? So before we do that, one of the things that we want to think about is, well, how good is the quality of my soil? We want to make sure that whatever it is we are growing is growing in that healthy soil sponge. So we talk about it a lot when we're talking about landscaping directly into the ground, which with planters you can in certain cases. But the idea is that we want to make sure we have that soil sponge. So that soil sponge is you've got all of those little tunnels, those little pockets. That is how the soil holds onto the water and then releases it to the plants as they need it. And the biology that is in the soil that creates those pockets is responsible for creating the nutrients for the plants. So if you want your plants to be resilient and thriving, it's super important that we do whatever we can to really increase the health of our soil. It is the foundation for anything in the garden. Other things we want to do, and again, not so much in the containers, but when we've got our planters that are growing right into the ground, we want to encourage our plant roots. Where the roots are is where the water is where the biology is where the nutrients are. So if all you've got is compacted soil with the roots in the top 2 inches, that is all your plants have access to. Instead, we want to encourage these roots that are growing deeper. It's basically like saying, well, I've got a baby jar worth of nutrients, or, I've got a gallon worth of nutrients. Your plants will be much happier with the second option. And the way that we're going to do that is we feed the soil. So no fertilizers are necessary. Instead, what we're going to do is a combination of compost and of mulch. So it's interesting how the principles that we use when we talk about watershed-wise landscaping applies to pots as well. So compost looks like soil, smells like a forest floor. It's very, very fine, especially with pots. You're just going to be sprinkling it into the pot every so often. You can mix it into the soil. With mulch, you want to make sure that that stays on top. So mulch is obviously bigger, but also, again, important in pots because the soil in a pot dries out so much more quickly. So mulch is going to help keep your soil cool, keep it moist, and then as it breaks down, it will also feed the biology in your soil. And then we don't usually think about oxygen. We think about water, we think about water all the time and, too much or not enough water, but we actually need a balance of oxygen in the soil as well, because if there isn't enough oxygen, you're going to get something called anaerobic life, and that is responsible for the pathogens that will potentially kill your plants. So how do we bring this soil in? Again, when it comes to a container, you're probably looking at a potting mix. If you are doing a planter that's in the ground, if at all possible, you want to be going into that native soil. So options are obviously these potting soils, potting mixes. They are typically a blend of different elements. They are pretty lightweight because it makes it easy to carry, makes it easy to deliver. So if anything, you are wanting to add compost to it. And then, of course, making sure that you're reading the labels, seeing what is actually in it. But if you are bringing in big planters, then at that point you are potentially having to, have it come in bulk, way cheaper than, bringing in a bunch of bags. And the thing again with potting soil is it is lighter to carry, it drains faster, and it dries out faster. So those are definitely things you need to think about when you are working with pots. Now, one of the things that you may or may not have discovered yet is you put a plant in and 6 months or a year later, it's like halfway down in the container. I had that happen to me in the beginning. The way you do that is you actually overfill it. You overfill it and then you pat it down, you overfill it a little bit more and you pat it down, because otherwise there's this subsidence that happens, right? Like it all starts to sink. And then as your plants are getting established over time, you are adding compost or worm castings, and then you are adding that mulch. And the mulch is, a couple of inches, right? It's not just a little sprinkling. All right, puzzle piece number 3, water and drainage. So especially in potted plants, water that sits in the plant basically will rot it. It gets very funky in there. You get that anaerobic life we talked about, and then your plants will die. So what it is, I had mentioned the oxygen at the very beginning, is that we are very accustomed to thinking about water in terms of there's not enough. I need to add more water. But it's also quite possible that we add too much water. And containers are a little bit challenging in that respect. And again, when you have that too much water, you don't have enough oxygen, and you get that funky life that starts to happen. So really what we want is that sweet spot Where there's enough water, there's enough oxygen, and that is where your plants will be very happy. Now, as far as watering different options, you can certainly hand water. That's really easy to do and lots of fun to sort of walk around. It's very meditative. There's these oyas. So they are made of terracotta. Terracotta actually will wick water, and you fill it up, and they're good for about a week. You fill it up, you put it in the soil, and then bit by bit, that water wicks out of the oya and makes its way out into the soil. And, based on this example, it will water or it will drop about an inch a day. So depending how big it is, you are just filling it up, maybe once a week. You might have a few of them scattered throughout the landscape. And then there's the possibility of getting these self-watering boxes, where basically you're going to pour the water into that basin and then you plant on top of it. And again, bit by bit, the plants will wick out the moisture that they need. Now you can build your own if you're feeling super creative, and some people are, but this is basically what it takes. So you can see that there is the pipe that accesses the reservoir, which is where the water is. Then there is sand and geotextile fabric, your soil, and then your vegetables. And then every so often you are refilling that reservoir, and it's just less maintenance than having to check moisture every so often, and then watering regularly. Now, depending on the size of your planters, you might want to consider bringing in some drip irrigation. So at this point, we're getting a little bit more involved. There's a little bit more technology, but absolutely doable, especially if you already have a drip system. And what you want to do is you want to set up a riser, if you have multiple planters here, for each one, with the option of being able to turn each box on and off individually. So the possibility that, maybe you are growing something, and then it goes out of season, or you're going to let it be dormant for a little while, then you turn off the water so that it's not running while nothing is really growing. Drip irrigation. Here's a little diagram. Basically, you can see that the drip lines are about 12 inches apart. This is done with inline drip, so the holes are already built into the emitter. We want to offset them a little bit, so we just get a nice consistent watering. And then, the option of every so often, maybe 2 or 3 times a year, you're actually flushing those drip lines. Now, one of the things that you want to understand, one of the things you want to understand is, how does water move through the different types of soil? So when we're in native soil, we compare clay, loam, and sand, clay, loam, and sand. And each of them flows at, different rates. But when we're also bringing potting soil into the equation, we need to understand what difference that makes. So with potting soil, our particles are larger, and there is more space between them. So basically, water is moving through potting soil much more quickly. Our coffee examples, we love our coffee examples. If you have sandy soil, it's like iced coffee, that water moves through relatively quickly. If you have clay soil, it's like a blended coffee, water moves through much more slowly. If I were to suck it out with a straw, it would take a little bit more effort. And then potting soil drains even more quickly than our sandy soils. So one of the questions we often get is, well, how much water do I actually need? Now, it's a little challenging to give you that answer because there are so many different variables, but this is just ballpark. I've got a planter. It's edibles, so relatively high water using plants, and I'm watering via drip. So you can see right off the bat, there's a huge difference between winter and summer watering. And then an even bigger difference between in-ground native soil and potting mix. So if you are watering your edibles during the summer and you've got potting mix, you are potentially watering 240 minutes per week. It's a lot of water. The other thing that's tricky with, especially with potting soil, is that if it gets completely dehydrated, it is almost impossible to re-wet it. So definitely in a container, you need to make sure that that soil stays moist. If it gets too dry, then you water it, and that water actually will run right through your pot. This is what happens when you have poor drainage issues. It can happen because your soil is compacted. It can happen when your container is blocked. You know, for example, I've had this. I speak from a lot of experience with this, with what can go wrong, and also what can go right. And you've got a hole at the bottom of your container, and over time, your plant will actually start sending its roots down until that hole gets completely clogged and no water is able to drain out of it. So this thing of water standing where your plants are in any scenario is a problem. So if you're working with a planter or a container, make sure that there is drainage. Don't buy a pot that doesn't have a hole in it. Oftentimes a nursery can actually drill that for you. So here are some different examples. This is Corten steel, super cool container, but you can see they've got weep holes built into them. This one, somebody was getting super creative with that crate. They just drilled holes in it. And then just so that you can see again the drainage that you need for a planter, this idea that there's different layers or levels to these. You've got your soil on top. You've got your geotextile cloth. So this is different than weed fabric. And what it does is it prevents the soil or the compost, what have you, to move through that into the gravel and the drainage areas. So you've got that cloth on top. Under it is the gravel. And then somewhere at the bottom are your weep holes or drainage holes. Now, if this is not what you want to see on your pretty white concrete patio, then you need to think about what happens to the water as it drains and how do you manage the staining that can either come from the color from the soil itself or sometimes materials in the water. So an easy one is to elevate your planter. So actually get them off the ground. So even if they drip, not a big deal, you can just hose it down. The idea is you don't want water just standing there. And then at that point, that is what discolors your surfaces. You can add these little feet, super cheap, easy to do, nice colors. All right. Oh my gosh, I've got to keep going here. All right, build your fourth puzzle piece for those of you that are feeling adventurous. All right, so if you're building a planter, and this is especially for folks that are interested in building like vegetable beds, typically you're looking at about 4 feet by 8 feet. This is kind of an optimal size in that the entire planter is accessible. If it gets too long or too wide, you can't reach over it. You're having to walk all the way around to get to the other side. So 4 by 8 is a pretty nice size. This is 12 to 18 inches high. So again, this is very, very doable yourself. And then what you want to pay attention to is what is the wood. So again, especially for an edible garden, anything that is touching the soil will influence the soil. So if you've got, wood that's been painted, or treated, all of that potentially can leach into your soil. And so you just want to be aware of that. And then, you've got the wood, that's the side. You're going to want something that will keep it in place, that will anchor it. Typically, we're doing like a 2 by 2 in the corners to help hold that shape. And then a 1 by 2 every, maybe 2 or 3 feet to make sure that it doesn't wobble, especially as you start filling it with soil. Now, I mentioned making sure that the inside, especially the inside of your planter, is protected. So watching out for paint, for stain, for pressure treated materials. Once upon a time, railroad ties were super popular and they were just loaded with chemicals you would not want to have in your food. Or you just picked up some free wood, you don't really know where it came from. Definitely you can actually use a pond liner. That's what this one was. And then that way you know that there is nothing that is potentially affecting the health of your soil. Now, I'm sure some of you have little critters. So if that is the case, this is a great time to plan for gophers, mold, what have you. And that is by putting in this metal, I'm trying to blank what they call it. It basically has to be thicker than chicken wire. So it's a mesh, relatively thick. You're going to go ahead and line your planters with it. And this is how those little guys keep from coming up and eating your carrots. And then at the beginning, we had talked about the possibility that if you do have weeds, even if you've whacked them back and cut them back, and yes, you're going to go ahead and put a planter on top of it, not a bad idea to add this layer of cardboard, or maybe a couple of layers of cardboard to just give you another level of protection. And then for those of you that get snails, this is really cool. Copper tape. They hate copper, so they may make their way up your planter, and then they hit that and they get like a little zap, and they will go right back down again. Now, something you may not have thought of is that you may want to move your planter at some point. Now, not if it's in the garden, obviously, but this is a beautiful planter. It's on my deck, but maybe at different times of the year, I want to move it. You will not be able to pick it up. So the idea of planning for that, whether it's casters or some sort of mobility feature that you can add to it so that it can move around your deck, your patio, etc. All right, oodles of options. This is where I do feel like the kid in the candy shop with how many different ways, different options you have. So this is an example. This is a beautifully designed planter. This is sort of where we cross the line from functional to beautiful, or functional and beautiful. It's made of redwood. They made the surface a little bit wider so you can, maybe not sit there for a very long time, but certainly while you are, pruning or picking your vegetables. They also added trellises for vines, and this idea of blending the container with the landscape. At the base, they actually have wild strawberries. So this is just a really lovely way of, it's not just a planter sitting on a surface, but it is a planter in a garden. Now here's a material that you may or may not be familiar with, and that is Trex. So Trex is considered a composite material. It works on the exterior. They don't really have a lot of structural strength. If it's not very big, you can get away with it. But certainly for the outside, they don't break down like woods do. They are pretty tough material. So they come in different colors. This is your basic, this is a down and dirty planter. It's maybe 6 to 8 inches high. Even I could build this. You can see instead of using those anchors that were made of wood, they just put some braces on it, screwed it in, and they're done. They are probably landscaping right into the soil, right into the native soils here. And this just creates a boundary. This is where my planter bed is. Challenge with that is it's not going to last terribly long, maybe 2-3 years, and then it will start to break down, especially with a pine, which is an inexpensive wood, but is also considered a softwood. So it will break down very much more quickly than, for example, a redwood. And then this is another one, a designed planter. And this one, they had issues with deer and other critters. So they've actually built in screens. The thing is completely screened in. There's a screen on top, and then you can see touching the ground are screens that can then be lifted back into the place after they're done with their gardening, their pruning, or their harvesting. And then here is an interesting option for, welcome home, right? So instead of it being gardens, it's planter beds, and it can be planter beds and gardens. So there's lots and lots of different ways to consider how you're going to use these materials. Another example, we're very used to seeing the slats go horizontally. This is to show you another option where you can do vertical slats instead. Something different happens with the eyes when we use that instead. It's definitely an interesting option. They've got iron trellises so that they can grow their beans and their squash and what have you. And then that horizontal rim, again, a little bit thicker so that you can comfortably put your hand on it or sit on it. Now, as we start moving into the stones, this takes a bit more experience and craftsmanship. This is flagstone, simple stacked stone. So there may not even be any mortar. There's no glue in here. They've just stacked it properly and then filled it with soil so that obviously it doesn't topple away. And then here we've got some examples of the poured in place concrete. Very, very important as this is being designed that you talk to your designer about how is the water draining out of this. It may be that they are simply, set on top of the soil and they can drain into the soil. And then how do you get irrigation in there if you want to put drip in there? Maybe at the end of the day you say, no, I want to hand water, but make sure that you ask those questions before it's poured. Something that's pretty useful, especially if you live in areas where it gets toasty, which can happen at any time of the year these days, is the idea that especially if you are starting seeds, you're putting in little plants, is that you've got shade cloth. And in this case, again, beautifully designed. You've got these metal posts and then you've got this colored fabric, but it doesn't have to be that complicated. The idea is that, as we go from like 10 to say 3, the hottest part of the day, that your seedlings have some protection from the sun. And then this is cool. This is like completely, you can dismantle it in 5 minutes. She just took some CMU blocks, again, no concrete, stacked them on top of each other, filled it with some potting soil and planted it. Another possibility is urbanite. So urbanite is broken up concrete. If you are taking, for example, you've got a concrete patio and you want to break it up to be able to use that material, and instead of using stone, you're recycling it, which is huge to be able to repurpose materials like that. And then this one is so much fun. This is a planter to lie on. So the idea, this is so clever. The idea that it looks like a bed and it is a planter. It's actually living turf there. And then I don't know if it's kumquats in the back or maybe tangerines as the headboard. And then this one's interesting because it's already a big pot, but what they did, it's going to be a tree. It is a tree that's planted in there. The tree that actually rises up to the second level is they've cut the bottom out so that the roots can make their way through the planter and then down into the soil itself. And this actually helps anchor a plant of this size. And then of course there's this container heaven, glazed, bright, colorful, shiny. You can just go to town on these, make sure they have holes in them. Corten steel, what I had talked about, also a very, very cool look, certainly with certain kinds of plants. One of the things to be aware of is depending on where you have them, they do get hot. So if you're going to use them, make sure that the interior is lined with some sort of insulation so you don't cook your little plants there. Now, also super, super fun are to work with terracotta pots. The bigger, the better, because as we looked at with those Oyas, they will actually wick water. And so it's actually not a bad idea to seal the inside of them. So not the hole, don't plug the hole, but seal the interior. And then that way the moisture stays in the plant for a longer period of time. And then you just get to play and have fun. So there are different ways, there's all different kinds of ways. I'm going to show you some pictures. You can go online and find some more. But the idea of playing with patterns, with rhythms, these, even though they're different sizes, they all have the same look. So there's definitely a sense of continuity here. And then this is like an herb garden that they've created. A wall of containers. These are all bulbs. You're out there watering every other day. So do this on perhaps a north wall where it's not going to, or an east facing wall where it's not going to, cook. Also beautiful in these types of arrangements are succulents. Those work really well. Really, almost anything works. And so remembering again, with almost anything working, make sure that you can account for the drainage, and especially if you have edibles that you are growing, that whatever lines the interior is not toxic. All right, last piece of the puzzle, your last opportunity to ask questions or to put questions in the Q&A, and then we'll talk about them at the end. But the last piece of the puzzle is the plants. I love this picture. Not all plants like containers. Some of them just not meant to go into containers. But here's some interesting information for the ones that do. So with vegetables, there are actually some vegetables that much prefer a deeper container. That includes things like tomatoes, cucumbers, eggplants, peppers, etc. So they're going to want to be able to go a little bit deeper compared to there's some vegetables that do just fine in a shallow pot. So that includes a lot of our greens, our radishes, our spinach, our onions, where the roots are just not going down as far. And again, the bigger the pot, I mean, this is really cool, but you're watering that pretty frequently. Now, this is great for herbs. The idea that you could go out there and just snip a little bit, you know, for your upcoming meal. I think they're called strawberry pots. Terracotta, again, if you can seal it, that helps that water hold on just a little bit longer. And as I mentioned, as far as succulents, they do great in pots. They are incredibly resilient. They're colorful. There's all kinds of architecture when it comes to succulents. So you definitely you can play. And in some cases, you know, we've talked about potting soil, we've talked about native soil. I definitely wouldn't do a native soil for the most part with a succulent. But it may be that you are looking at an actual cactus soil when you are looking at planting succulents. They just drain more quickly. Now, as far as the aesthetics, here's some things to consider. We start out with what are the thrillers of your plants? What are the accents? And this can be, if it's all pots, or this can certainly be if this is a pot in a landscape, like that one example, what catches the eye? So here are some examples. These are flaxes that look super cool. Fruit trees, dwarf lemon, orange, mandarin, apple, any of those you can put into a pot. Again, make sure it is a big pot and that you do a lot of that overfilling and padding because you don't want to come back in a couple of years and have it sunk down halfway. Other great plants are roses. So roses, especially if there's some nice sunshine, do really, really well in pots. Some other examples, some of these are more green. So you're looking really at, they're more like foundations. They're upright, but maybe they're not quite as thrilling as, for example, a rose bush. But it does include things like azaleas, Japanese maples, which are pretty stunning. That's a beautiful combination. Actually, the Japanese aesthetic in a container with those beautiful red or brilliant green foliage. And so you go from thrillers down to the fillers. So those are kind of the mid-level plants. I have found in my experience, it is better, not always, to do these accent plants per pot. Sometimes they will show you, these beautifully designed where you've got 15 different plants in a pot. But the reality is that those roots grow pretty quickly. The soil starts to disappear. So I have found it to be the idea that I create that same sensibility, but putting fewer plants in one pot to create the different levels. So in this case, we've got geranium, which does super well in pots. Here are some other examples. Depending on where you live, you can definitely experiment with all kinds of things. There are actually indoor plants that you can put into pots so long as it stays in the shade. But all of these are beautiful and blooming or have interesting foliage. Here's another example. This is known as a crane's bill. Even when it's not blooming, the foliage is delicate and lacy, so it creates like a background for other plants that may be thrilling. This is an example where they're probably repotting their tulips when they're done with other annuals, but you can definitely see those spillers It includes things like lantanas, those trailing lantanas, the snow in summer, the ground morning glory. So lots of different options. If it grows that way out in the landscape, there's a good chance you can do the same thing with it in a pot. And then other things to look at is, up to this point, maybe you've been thinking about how plants compare and contrast to other plants, but the possibility that you take another look and you go, well, how does my plant work with my container choices? So in this example, we definitely have this contrasting happen. So you've got this, goodness, it's almost like a chartreuse, pale green, going up against maybe it's a geranium or a fuchsia, and then you've got this gray pot that just anchors the whole thing. And then not just color, but we have to remember that we're also working with textures. So this is kind of an interesting mix in that the water needs are a little bit different between the oxalis and that succulent. But maybe it's something you put out for a party and you play, and at some point the oxalis goes dormant and then comes back up later in the year. And so really, there are so very many possibilities to have fun, to experiment, to play. One of the great things about containers is, if something dies, you just replace it. You can get things in small sizes, in 4-inch pots, and plant them. And so once you have the container, it can either be something that, stays the same for years on end, or something that you are changing seasonally. I mean, this is where the annuals work. You put them in, and then come, next season, you bring in whatever is blooming at that time. Or again, you've got your perennials or small trees that are there most of the year. And then you've got the accents that come in with the color in order to flesh it out, to bring it to life. And that brings us to the end of today's presentation.
Okay.
We did it.
Well, I have a couple of great questions. I mean, we really got into block walls.
Okay.
What to do with block walls, how to mask them, and I talked about all different things from color to stucco to putting posts with weld wire mesh fencing on it to grow vines. All different kinds of things can be done. I mean, I've painted walls and then done stencils on them. If it's inside your garden, you could hire somebody to come and do like a, artwork on it. They could be, you could do a mosaic on a wall just as easily as you could even put like flagstone on it and erase it. So that was a good bit of question and answer there. And that kind of led into this thing about, do block planters get too hot? And what about roots? What about roots touching the block planter? Is that going to, does it leach anything? Is that going to be bad? And I've never had any issue with roots touching block planter. There's nothing that is going to go wrong there. There are issues with effervescence coming, rather efflorescence coming through. It is effervescent, but it's efflorescence coming through the wall as different materials, as the wall is basically kind of breaking down. It's going to take a very long time for it to break down, but the water will interact with various elements in the wall. And so you get these like deposits on the outside of the walls. And that can be unsightly, but it also can be super cool. Just think about like, ancient stucco walls in Rome and places like that, and how amazing they are with all the efflorescence on them. So it's not really, it's an aesthetic thing more than a quality of plant life thing. One question about, are there any are there any issues about if you use a metal screen on the bottom of the planter and then you pull out plants? Is it going to be hard to do that because they're in the mesh? And I said, we don't pull plants out. So I don't know how to answer that other than that. And the response was, well, doesn't leaving roots in place, make it hard to plant in that area? And the answer is no. Actually, those roots should decompose. They are organic matter to decompose, just as though you put compost or something else great into the soil to uh, help with the soil organic matter. The roots themselves will be decomposed and turned into soil. So cutting them at the base, cutting anything that you have at the base when you're ready to change out the landscape, the planter, cut it, and then add some worm castings or so forth on top, and then plant your new stuff in it. If you have, especially if you have raised planters that have screens on the bottom of them, don't bother trying to pull out the plants. But you might have a different take on that.
No, 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 same thing. I mean, we talk about it, and then I don't know if it was clear that you would just cut the plant. So if you've got your carrots and they're, well, not carrots, because you are pulling those out.
Yeah.
But that you would just snip it at the base. And potentially you're doing, if there are weeds that are showing up, it's the same thing. You can just snip it, and then it breaks down beneath the soil. So
There's a question about sealing terracotta pots. So to be clear, I do not ever seal terracotta pots. There are a lot of different options for terracotta. And so I always try, well, not always, I shouldn't say that. It depends on what I'm going for in the garden. But what I mean by options for terracotta is terracotta can be high fired, very fine clay, high fired. And you find this with like your really good Italian pots, your really good European pots, high fired containers. If that's the case, the density of the holes that are in the terracotta, it's very compacted. It's super it's super waterproof. It's basically almost like having I don't want to say a glass container, but it is it's definitely going to hold a lot more water. It doesn't have as much air exchange, into the container from the outside because it's just super dense. That's when you're going to be paying, hundreds of thousands of dollars for containers. You get the really super high fired ones. That's great. If you're doing a tree, that's what you plant your trees in. That's answering another question. But there's also low fired terracotta. So, and these are the kinds of things like that you might find, if you went to like a store that was specializing in low fired Mexican terracotta pots or Southwestern US terracotta pots. And these are they're very porous. So a lot of water can go in and out. And you might like the efflorescence that builds up on the outside of the terracotta pot as the water leaches through and minerals leach through. That is a look. It's gorgeous. I mean, I love that. But if you don't like that, then you need to put some kind of sealant on the inside of those terracotta pots to close up those pores so that the water from the soil is not getting into the terracotta and starting to break it down. I mean, I used to like terracotta pots, when they were actually starting to crumble. I would paint the outside with flat latex paint, always flat latex, by the way, in the landscape, flat latex or solid body stain, either one, they're kind of the same thing. That's what you use in the landscape, not anything shiny. You don't use primer when you're doing this stuff. Oh, that's a whole other topic. But anyway, paint directly on the surface with the flat latex or with the solid body stain. And but in the case of terracotta, right, low fire. the water would come through and kind of bubble up the paint, and it would be all, I mean, within two or 3 months, it would look like it had been there centuries. I know I kind of went off on that. But anyway, that's all aesthetics. So that's why you line terracotta pots, is to keep them from crumbling and falling apart if they are low fired. Let's see. How often do you need to repot plants as they grow, especially trees? Well, maybe you want to take that. I had a point of view, but you may want to take that.
Yeah, I mean, that's a tricky one. It depends what you've planted, how it's been planted. Sometimes, I mean, especially when you look at a pot, let me see if I can do it, that is like this. You've basically gotten yourself in a position where it's almost impossible to get the plant out of it. So it is something to think about when you're picking your pot, and then, that something might grow. So typically, I mean, at the point you're looking at is when it looks like it's on the verge of becoming root bound, when you've got so much roots in there that it's almost like there's no soil left. Probably sooner than that, then you're going to go ahead and transplant it. I don't know that there would be a hard and fast rule to that. The other thing is making sure that, again, that hole at the bottom of the pot, or on the sides of the pot, haven't gotten so clogged with roots that water isn't able to leave them. But I'm not sure what else to add.
Yeah. So I said a couple things. One, the only way I repot is if I'm ready to break the old pot. Like, you're ready to throw away the old pot. So
Right.
just to be clear, that's probably going to happen. Trying to get a tree out of a container.
Yeah, a ficus.
The thing is too, well, ficus is the whole thing, but any tree, a fight, yeah. So the thing is that why do you need to repot it? I mean, just keep pruning the canopy, and you don't really need to repot it, especially if it's a large enough container when you started. I mean, that's really what you have to think about, is make sure you have a container the size that is going to accommodate the tree when it gets to, a maturity, as opposed to planting in something small and then trying to upsize it. That's just a lot of work. That sounds like a lot of work. That doesn't sound good to me. The other thing that I was answering questions, so I didn't see, that big tall container that you showed a picture of, like a really super big tall container, and then it
Or
had
you
tree
cut
coming out.
yeah, and you cut the bottom?
Yes, so did you talk about that? I didn't hear you say that. Okay, yeah. And I do that, so that I do that pretty much in all of my trees that are in containers. If I can, I will plan my hardscape so that there is a gap in the hardscape where the container is going to be, and then break the bottom of the container, place the container on the open surface, it could be a small open surface, but the open surface, plant my tree into it, and then that's it. That tree is there forever. It's going into the container and ultimately into the ground, but that's the way you get the tree up higher, or the shrub or whatever it is up higher, so you have the visual interest to it. If you don't have the luxury of being able to make a hole in your hardscape, then you're going to have to keep that canopy under control, and it's more of a challenge. Anyway, let's see. There are a couple of coffee grounds for potted plants. Are they good for potted plants? It's organic matter. I would never just put coffee grounds into any plant in a container. I would run it through my compost pile first. But I don't know. Do you have any thoughts about that?
No, I had the same thought, a little bit, yes. But yeah, I would break it down with other material, or just break it down.
Yeah, it's better to be mixed into a compost pile or through a compost pile. Large pots that I did not expect to move. I sit on the ground on a it looks like maybe on a DG surface. I wonder how hot potting mix. I wonder
How much
how
potting
much
mix?
potting mix to put in them. pretty full, half the height, and should there be several inches of stones or rocks in the bottom? Okay, so this is, I think, maybe getting at the whole thing of mixing it with decomposed granite. You talked about that, right?
No, so I didn't talk about that, no.
Well, so you don't usually have to put rock on the bottom of a container. I mean, you can, but I have actually found that it kind of holds moisture there at the bottom of the container, so that can also be a not good thing. The best thing, in my opinion, is to put a piece of filter cloth over the hole, make the holes, put the filter cloth over the holes so that at least it keeps the soil from coming through the holes. And then filling the containers up with a mix of decomposed granite and worm castings, and mixing that, like it's like a 90-10 mix. It's 90% decomposed granite, 10% worm castings, which is a lot of worm castings, because that's something you use very little of usually. But yeah, so you mix it up in a big container, in a wheelbarrow, and then fill the container with that and compact it around the plants as you plant them. What is this doing? Well, the decomposed granite, especially if you're watering it as you're filling the container, it gets very hard. It gets very, very, very hard in the container, almost feeling like concrete a little bit. But it's porous. So you can, and it doesn't settle. So once it's in the container, it keeps that soil height. The stuff that makes the planter settle is organic matter. So if you only have 10% organic matter, that is only settling a little tiny bit, which you can always top dress with a little bit more worm castings and some mulch on top of everything. And I do keep that on top of the planter. But you could fill the planter with a mix of decomposed granite and worm castings and not have that settling that goes down. But again, very heavy container.
Yes.
Very, very, very heavy. And really the plant, where do you put the collar? Where do you put where the trunk meets the soil? How far above or below the rim of the planter do you make sure that is for the plants?
Oh, so if I had the rim of the planter, the soil is probably just a little bit below it because it's all gonna sink if I'm not using the DG. And then the collar would be above that, maybe half an inch or an inch, so that you don't get the dip.
So in other words, if you put a level across the top of the planter, your collar would probably be right where that level is, sitting on top of the planter, which means that the soil is coming up pretty high to the top of your planters when you fill it up. So that was one of these questions, how high do you fill it and all that sort of thing. Yeah, you fill it up pretty high, and even like mound it up so that when it sinks down, it doesn't sink too low.
Yeah.
Let's see. Okay, cache pots inside of large pots. I've never done that. Cache pots go, so a cache pot, like a saucer, basically, goes underneath the planter. So the planter is either raised up on feet, or like concrete blocks or bricks or something, and it's raised up, and then the cache pot, the saucer, can slide underneath the planter that way to catch any water that might come out of the bottom of the container and stain hardscape or whatever. That is a way to do that. And the surface the plant's containers sit on is granite, not adding granite. Okay, so it's on decomposed granite. I'm imagining decomposed granite, right? So that I would treat that like a hardscape, basically. I would basically, if you wanted to have an area where the tree was going into the ground, I would cut away the decomposed granite in a circle the size of, or approximate circle or square, the size of the little bit smaller than the base of the container, and then sit the container back down on top of the decomposed granite, but there's an opening underneath the container. And that would be how I would do that. Or even if you cut away the decomposed granite, you could actually sink the container down a little bit so the decomposed granite comes up maybe an inch or so around the edge of the container. That would be actually a nice finished look. I don't know if I'm answering that or not, but hopefully I am. Let's see. I think that's pretty much all the questions. And
Yeah. Yeah. Well, what an evening. Thank you so much for joining us. And again, we'll be sending out an email with information about accessing the recording. We'll have a printout of the Q&A available for you. And then we will have this last Q&A section available for you as well.